If health is the body's natural state of balance, and illness is merely a deviation from that perfect equilibrium, tell me, what ancient imbalance are you currently wrestling with as you settle down for this long history, and which hemisphere is hosting your eventual surrender to slumber? Comment below. Confirm to the digital guardians of tranquility that you are ready for a systematic, unhurried examination of humanity's long, often clumsy attempt to mend itself. We begin our story deep in the shadows of prehistory, in a time before the concept of medicine even existed, when healing was indistinguishable from magic, fear, and sheer brute empiricism. We must first transport ourselves back hundreds of thousands of years, to the lower and middle Paleolithic eras, a time characterized by nomadic hunter-gatherer societies existing in brutal proximity to immediate environmental threats and inevitable physical trauma. Survival was an absolute prerequisite for healing. Medicine, in this context, was purely reactionary and based on two foundational, intertwined principles: instinct and external causality. Instinctively, early hominids, like many animals, learned to staunch bleeding by applying pressure, to immobilize a broken limb by resting it, and to cool fevered skin with water. This crude, undeniable efficacy formed the earliest empirical baseline of human healing knowledge. The first doctors were simply the individuals within the tribe who possessed superior observational skills and memory, recalling which specific leaves staunched a wound, which roots induced purging, and which water source did not cause fatal stomach distress. This collective memory, passed down verbally and through imitation, was the first human pharmacy, limited entirely by local botany and geology. More profoundly defining, however, was the concept of external causality. Unable to observe the microscopic pathogens that caused internal illness, ancient humans attributed sudden sickness, inexplicable fevers, or persistent pain to external, non-physical forces. Illness was viewed not as a biological malfunction, but as a spiritual event. The intrusion of an evil spirit, the curse of a rival tribe, or the displeasure of a powerful deity. The healer's role, therefore, was primarily socio-religious rather than biological. This individual, often the shaman, the witch doctor, or the medicine man, was tasked with mediating between the visible, suffering world and the invisible, causative spiritual world. Their tools were not scalpels or compounds, but trance, ritual, incantation, and specialized symbolic knowledge. The treatment for a severe cough was not an expectorant. It was an elaborate ritual to exorcise the offending entity that had taken up residence in the patient's chest. The shaman's success hinged less on curing the biological ailment and more on restoring the patient's and the community's belief in spiritual order, demonstrating mastery over the unseen, forces that governed life and death. The efficacy of this treatment was heavily reliant on the powerful placebo effect, a psychological healing mechanism that remains a potent, if poorly understood, aspect of all medicine, from the Stone Age to the modern hospital. The physical evidence of this early medical engagement is sparse but incredibly compelling, preserved in the paleopathological record. Perhaps the most striking and durable piece of evidence is trepanation, the deliberate drilling or scraping of a hole into the human skull. This remarkably dangerous, complex surgical procedure has been found in skeletal remains across disparate cultures and continents, dating back as far as 7000 BCE in sites in Peru and Europe. The prevalence of trepanation, often showing evidence of bone regeneration, meaning the patient survived the procedure for years, suggests it was a practiced, established medical art. While modern speculation suggests trepanation might have been a crude attempt to treat skull fractures or perhaps relieve pressure from intracranial swelling, the anthropological consensus posits a far more common reason: ritual and spiritual healing. If headache, epilepsy, or mental illness were caused by an evil spirit trapped within the cranium, the only logical remedy in the shamanic worldview was to provide an immediate escape route. The execution of this surgery required immense physical skill, rudimentary knowledge of hygiene, often using fire or boiling water, and undeniable social authority. No individual would willingly submit to a skull being scraped open unless the practitioner held profound power, and the belief in the external cause was absolute. The sheer audacity of this procedure, performed without anesthesia or modern antiseptic knowledge, underscores the profound desperation and the absolute conviction of early humanity in the non-biological origins of disease. The success of this era's medicine was not biological precision, but the deep foundational resilience of the human organism to endure trauma and the power of shared cultural faith to impose meaning upon suffering. The first significant leap away from pure magic and toward systematic, though still heavily spiritual, empiricism occurred with the rise of the great river valley civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, dating from roughly 3500 BCE. These societies, fueled by the stable, surplus output of organized agriculture and the necessities of urban planning, began to generate written records, allowing us to trace the codification of medical practice. In Mesopotamia, particularly under the reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, circa 1754 BCE, medicine achieved its first formal regulatory structure. The famous Code of Hammurabi, primarily known for its principles of justice, an eye for an eye, contains surprisingly detailed sections concerning the fees and, crucially, the penalties associated with medical practice. The code established tiered pricing structures. A successful operation performed on a nobleman was far more expensive than the same procedure on a commoner or a slave. But the true innovation was the establishment of liability. If a doctor operates on a man for a severe wound with a bronze lancet and causes the man to die, or opens an abscess of the eye for a man with a bronze lancet and destroys the man's eye, they shall cut off his hands. This terrifying penalty system institutionalized the consequences of medical failure, forcing practitioners to adhere to established, recognized procedures and imposing a powerful brake on risky innovation. Babylonian medicine, practiced by the ASU, physicians using herbs, and the Ashipu, sorcerers using incantations, was a highly bureaucratic blend of observational remedy and astrological divination, governed by the fear of physical mutilation for error. Meanwhile, ancient Egyptian medicine, flourishing perhaps 1,000 years earlier, exhibited a more sophisticated, though still heavily mystical, understanding of the human body. Egyptian doctors, often high-status priests, were the first recorded medical specialists, dentists, eye doctors, and surgeons. The monumental step forward was a development of systematic anatomical observation, necessitated by the elaborate rituals of mummification. Although the mummification process itself was performed by ritual workers often separate from the doctors, The sheer scale of the practice provided an unprecedented, albeit static, view of internal organs and structures. This observational knowledge, recorded and passed down through generations, is preserved most powerfully in documents like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, c. 1600 BCE, but copying material dating back to 3000 BCE, which is essentially an ancient surgical manual. This text details the examination, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment of 48 distinct cases of trauma, mostly battlefield wounds, fractures, dislocations, head wounds. Crucially, the approach of the Smith Papyrus is rational and empirical. It advises the practitioner to determine, through physical examination, whether a specific injury is treatable, often concluding with the stark, pragmatic prognosis, an ailment not to be treated. This clear, dispassionate clinical assessment, recognizing the limits of the doctor's ability, stands as one of the most remarkable historical departures from purely magical intervention. A fleeting glimpse of pre-Greek rationalism obscured by the long shadows of religious dogma. However, even the most advanced Egyptian medicine was riddled with systematic error derived from their religious cosmology. While they accurately identified the heart as the center of the vascular system, they believed the brain, a structure they regularly scooped out and discarded during mummification, was merely a packing material, holding no importance for consciousness or intelligence. They believed that the body was permeated by a system of channels running from the heart, carrying blood, air, and various other fluids, but were often confused about their precise function, leading to erroneous diagnoses and treatments based on the need to clear blockages in these channels through purging, bleeding, and pharmaceutical intervention. The overall framework remained a difficult synthesis of advanced anatomical observation, driven by pragmatic necessity, and pervasive spiritual causality, driven by theological necessity. The failure of ancient medicine, despite its early observational successes, was its inability to bridge this gap. It lacked a rational philosophical framework, a theory of disease causation, that could systematically replace the invocation of spirits and the fear of penalties with a testable, verifiable, and universally applicable scientific model. This necessary philosophical foundation would finally emerge, though slowly and controversially, from the Mediterranean shores of classical Greece. The true intellectual revolution in medicine, the shift from the empirical catalog of symptoms to a comprehensive, theoretical understanding of the body, began in classical Greece, culminating in the work of Hippocrates of Kos, c. 460–370 BCE. Hippocrates, and the influential school associated with his name, is traditionally credited with fundamentally separating the practice of medicine from religious superstition and philosophical speculation, establishing it instead as a distinct secular discipline based on rational observation. The core contribution of the Hippocratic school was the radical proposal that disease was not a divine punishment or a magical intrusion, but a natural process caused by quantifiable physical disturbances within the body, accessible to human reason and observation. The philosophical framework that undergirded this rationalism was the humoral theory. This theory, perhaps the most enduring and pervasive medical model in Western history, posited that the human body was composed of 4 cardinal fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, or eucrasia, was maintained when these four humors existed in perfect balance in terms of quantity and quality. Illness, or dyscrasia, was caused by an excess or deficiency of one or more humors. For example, an excess of blood led to fever and aggression. An excess of black bile led to melancholy. The diagnostic process involved observing signs like color, temperature, excretion, especially urine, and temperament, all interpreted as manifestations of humoral imbalance. The therapeutic goal was straightforward: to restore balance, usually through interventions designed to evacuate the excessive humor, such as bleeding, venesection, purging, emetics and laxatives, sweating, or diet modification. The profound power of the humoral theory lay not in its physiological accuracy, it was entirely incorrect, but in its unparalleled systemic coherence. It provided a single, universally applicable, and intellectually satisfying framework that explained all known diseases, prescribed a clear course of action, and, crucially, maintained the doctor's authority. The doctor did not need divine revelation. They needed only disciplined observation and an understanding of the balance. The Hippocratic corpus also introduced concepts foundational to modern medical ethics and practice: the importance of prognosis, the detailed recording of clinical cases, the earliest patient charts, and the fundamental principle of primum non nocere, first do no harm. The famous Hippocratic oath, while likely written after his time, cemented the high moral and professional standards expected of the practitioner. However, the very elegance and completeness of the humoral theory became its greatest historical impediment. Because the theory offered a comprehensive explanation for everything, it actively discouraged further anatomical investigation and the search for external causes. If fever was simply an excess of blood, why bother looking for a microscopic pathogen or a specific organ malfunction? The therapy was defined by the theory, bleeding, purging, leading to centuries of therapeutic stagnation and the systematic application of treatments that were often ineffective or actively harmful, particularly venesection, which became a ritualistic universal remedy for virtually every ailment, depleting the patient of vital fluid based on a completely abstract theory of balance. The Hippocratic legacy, therefore, is a complex paradox. It liberated medicine from spiritual causality, but locked it into a theoretical prison that would resist challenge for nearly 2 millennia, ensuring that even as knowledge of the external world exploded, knowledge of the internal human body remained static and fundamentally flawed. The authority of Hippocrates was inherited, amplified, and ultimately ossified by the formidable figure of Claudius Galen, 129 to c. in 216 CE, a Greek physician working primarily within the powerful apparatus of the Roman Empire. Galen was arguably the most influential medical mind between Hippocrates and the Renaissance. He was a tireless clinician, a skilled surgeon, and a prolific writer, producing hundreds of volumes that systematized and expanded upon the humoral theory. His works became the undisputed medical canon of the Western and Islamic worlds for over 1,500 years, a testament to his intellectual rigor, his aggressive self-promotion, and the sheer inertia of institutionalized dogma. Galen's enduring contribution was his detailed, experimental approach to anatomy and physiology. Because Roman law forbade the dissection of human cadavers, Galen based his extensive anatomical treatises almost entirely on the dissection of animals, primarily pigs, Barbary apes, and oxen. He documented in remarkable detail the circulatory, nervous, and musculoskeletal systems of these animals, projecting his findings onto the human body with absolute confidence. This reliance on comparative anatomy led to massive, fundamental errors that became enshrined as unchallengeable truth. Most famously, Galen asserted that the liver, not the heart, was the origin of the venous system and the factory for blood production. He believed this venous blood was consumed by the tissues and constantly replenished. His circulatory model was based on the premise that blood sloshed between the two sides of the heart through invisible pores in the interventricular septum, a concept that entirely precluded the idea of continuous circulation. Furthermore, he believed the nervous system utilized a fluid called pneuma to transmit sensation and motion. Galen's genius lay in synthesizing all previous medical thought, Hippocratic humors, Aristotelian philosophy, and his own detailed animal observation, into a single, coherent, utterly comprehensive system that had an answer for every symptom and a justification for every treatment. His authority was so overwhelming, his writing so meticulous, and his personality so domineering that his conclusions transcended mere theory and became dogma. Any observation by later practitioners that contradicted Galen's texts was, by default, dismissed as an aberration in the patient or an error by the observer, never a flaw in the foundational text. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the subsequent preservation of Galenic texts by the early Christian Church only amplified this authority, rendering Galen's anatomical errors immune to empirical correction until the Renaissance. For over 15 centuries, the entire medical profession operated under a massive, systematic, factual error about how the body actually worked, a profound historical illustration of the dangers of theoretical elegance supplanting empirical verification. While a sophisticated, flawed theoretical medicine flourished under Galen, the Roman Empire's true, monumental contribution to health was in the field of public health and sanitation, an area often overlooked in favor of individual medical breakthroughs. The Romans were supreme civil engineers, applying their organizational genius not to the curing of individual disease, but to the systemic management of the urban environment. They understood, implicitly, that densely packed populations required infrastructure to prevent the inevitable proliferation of communicable disease, even though they lacked any knowledge of germ theory. The construction of vast, elaborate networks of aqueducts, engineering marvels that carried millions of gallons of fresh, clean mountain water into Roman cities, was a public health measure of staggering consequence, providing clean drinking, bathing, and cleaning water that dramatically reduced the prevalence of waterborne illnesses like cholera and dysentery. Coupled with this, they developed sophisticated systems of sewers, cloaca maxima, designed to efficiently channel human waste out of the city centers. While the Romans did not understand why contaminated water caused illness, their solution, separation of clean water from waste, was correct and effective. This commitment to sanitation extended to public bathhouses, widespread use of latrines, and strict organized management of waste disposal. This systemic approach was driven by military necessity and urban control. A healthy, functional army and a stable, non-plague-ridden population were prerequisites for maintaining the vast empire. Furthermore, the Romans established some of the earliest forms of institutionalized medical care, particularly for their legions. The valetudinaria were organized, efficient military hospitals designed to treat large numbers of wounded and sick soldiers, featuring segregated rooms, clean water access, and standardized care protocols. These institutions represented a massive organizational leap over earlier, ad hoc care arrangements. Yet, despite this profound pragmatic success in public sanitation, Roman individual medicine remained fundamentally flawed, tied by the unbreakable chains of Galenic authority. Furthermore, this advanced public health infrastructure largely collapsed with the fragmentation of the Western Empire, leaving successor states without the engineering capability or the centralized political will to maintain such complex systems. The medieval period that followed would inherit Galen's anatomical errors, but largely lose Rome's unparalleled organizational skill, leading to centuries of regression in urban sanitation and a corresponding surge in epidemic diseases that swept through the unmanaged, unsanitary urban centers that struggled to survive in the post-Roman West. The lesson here is clear. Systemic health improvements often rely more on engineering and civic governance than on individual brilliance in curing disease. The historical period often referred to as the Middle Ages, roughly 5th to 15th centuries, is frequently and inaccurately characterized as a period of complete medical stagnation in the West. While it is true that systematic anatomical investigation ceased and urban sanitation regressed severely following the collapse of Roman infrastructure, this era was crucial for the preservation of classical knowledge and the integration of the new pharmacological traditions, primarily under the auspices of the monastic orders and the rapidly expanding Islamic Empire. In Western Europe, the torch of learning, including Galenic and Hippocratic texts, was largely held by the Christian monasteries. Monks meticulously copied and maintained the ancient texts in their libraries, ensuring that the flawed yet systematic knowledge survived the political turmoil of the age. More practically, monasteries were centers of healing based on herbalism. The monks cultivated physic gardens, maintaining centuries of empirical knowledge regarding local flora and their medicinal properties. These monastic infirmaries offered rudimentary care, shelter, and comfort, blending spiritual care, prayer, and consolation with empirically tested herbal remedies, poultices, teas, and tinctures. Monastic medicine was defined by its holistic, communal approach, prioritizing comfort and the management of symptoms over risky surgical intervention, adhering to the principle that disease was both a physical ailment and a spiritual test. However, the true intellectual engine of medical progress during this period was the flourishing Islamic Golden Age, 8th to 13th centuries, where the ancient Greek and Roman texts were translated, studied, and significantly expanded upon. Scholars like Al-Razi, Rhazes, c. 520 CE, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, 980-1037 CE, not only preserved Galen but refined pharmacological science and pioneered systematic clinical differentiation. Al-Razi, for instance, authored the first clinical text differentiating smallpox from measles, a crucial diagnostic achievement based purely on meticulous clinical observation. Avicenna's monumental work, The Canon of Medicine, synthesized Greco-Roman knowledge with Persian and Indian traditions, becoming the single most authoritative medical textbook globally until the 17th century. The canon meticulously detailed anatomy, pharmacology, and clinical practice, maintaining the humoral framework but also introducing advanced concepts of contagion and systematic experimentation with herbal remedies. Crucially, the Islamic world pioneered the Bimaristan, sophisticated public hospitals that were dedicated exclusively to the care of the sick, funded by charitable endowments, Waqf. These hospitals were not simply shelters, they were centers for teaching, research, and specialized care, often featuring segregated wards for different diseases, pharmacies, and dedicated lecture halls. This represented a massive institutional leap forward, demonstrating a civic commitment to public health and the professionalization of medical training, far exceeding anything seen in the contemporary West. The sophisticated Islamic model, blending institutional care, advanced pharmacology, and rigorous textual analysis, stood in stark contrast to the West's less developed system. When Western European scholars began to re-engage with these texts via translation centers in Sicily and Spain during the 12th and 13th centuries, they initiated the intellectual revival that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. The immense preservation and intellectual refinement achieved during the Islamic Golden Age ensured that when the West was finally ready for renewed scientific inquiry, it possessed the full, albeit flawed, Galenic and Hippocratic inheritance, refined by centuries of scholarship. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe in the mid-14th century, starting around 1347, represented the single greatest, most devastating public health crisis in recorded history, simultaneously highlighting the impotence of the prevailing medical theories and forcing the establishment of rudimentary yet crucial epidemiological concepts that would shape future responses to mass contagion. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis carried by fleas on rats, swept across the continent with terrifying speed and lethality, killing an estimated 30% to 60% of Europe's population in just 4 years, collapsing social structures, economies, and religious faith. The prevailing medical theories, Galenic humoral theory and the belief in divine wrath or astrological misalignment, offered no effective defense. Doctors, often wearing grotesque beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, a mistaken attempt to filter the miasma, or bad air, believed to be the source of disease, were powerless. Bleeding, purging, and the application of noxious substances were the only tools, all entirely ineffective against a bacterial infection transmitted by vector. The scale of the failure was absolute. The knowledge of the human body and disease causality was so fundamentally wrong that the only rational responses were isolation and flight. It was this profound systemic failure that spurred the first true institutionalization of public health measures since the Romans, driven by sheer necessity and desperate empirical observation. Italian city-states, recognizing that the disease followed trade routes and human movement, pioneered the concept of quarantine. The term itself derives from the Venetian quarantina, a 40-day waiting period imposed on ships arriving from infected ports before passengers and crew were allowed to disembark. This measure was crude, often poorly enforced, and certainly based on a misunderstanding of the actual incubation period. But the fundamental principle that separating the potentially diseased from the healthy population could slow or halt transmission was a massive empirical leap forward. Furthermore, cities began establishing permanent boards of health, empowered to enforce sanitation measures, manage mass burials, regulate medical practitioners, and restrict movement. These institutions, born out of the terror of the plague, became the progenitors of modern epidemiological surveillance and control bodies. The crisis forced a radical restructuring of the relationship between civic authority and public health, establishing the precedent that the state held the right to impose drastic measures, including isolation, movement restrictions, and the destruction of contaminated property, to protect the collective health of the community. The plague did more than just kill. It irrevocably destabilized the authority of Galenic medicine, opening the door for future challenge. When the most learned physicians could offer no better prognosis or treatment than the most superstitious peasant, the intellectual foundations of the medical canon were severely shaken. The catastrophe created a massive labor shortage, leading to the rise of less formally trained but often more practical lay healers and surgeons who were not constrained by the old texts. The plague set the stage for the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance, forcing scholars to look beyond the texts of the ancients and, finally, to look directly at the human body itself. The Renaissance, 14th to 16th centuries, marked the long-awaited empirical confrontation with the systematic errors of Galen, an intellectual struggle primarily fought through the illegal yet essential act of human dissection. For 15 centuries, the medical world had adhered to Galen's anatomical projections derived from apes and pigs. The challenge was led by Andreas Vesalius, 1514-1564, a Flemish physician who worked at the University of Padua, the premier medical school of the age. Vesalius, rejecting the tradition of lecturing from a text while a lower-status barber surgeon performed the dissection, insisted on performing the dissections himself, directly exposing students to the reality of human anatomy. Vesalius's monumental work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, 1543, published in the same year as Copernicus's revolutionary astronomical text, meticulously documented the structure of the human body based on direct observation. The Fabrica was not just a medical text, it was a revolution in scientific illustration and publishing, featuring stunningly detailed, accurate woodcut engravings of muscles, bones, and organs. In the pages of the Fabrica, Vesalius systematically exposed Galen's most profound errors. He showed that the human mandible was a single bone, not two, as in the ape, that the sternum was composed of 3 parts, not 7, and, most crucially, he demonstrated that the interventricular septum of the heart had no visible pores for blood to pass, directly contradicting Galen's entire circulatory model. Vesalius's method, the insistence on empirical observation over textual authority, was a philosophical earthquake that irrevocably shifted the paradigm of medical education and research. Yet, his work did not instantly dismantle Galenism. The inertia of the system was immense. Conservative medical faculties rejected his findings, accusing him of using anomalous or deformed cadavers. It took decades for the medical world to fully accept that the canonical authority they had trusted for a millennium was fundamentally wrong. Vesalius was the intellectual insurgent who provided the irrefutable evidence, but the eventual acceptance of his work required the slow death of a generation of conservative professors. Contemporaneous to Vesalius's anatomical challenge, a different revolution was brewing in chemistry and pharmacology, driven by the controversial figure of Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, known as Paracelsus, 1493-1541. Paracelsus was an alchemist, a physician, and a radical who openly scorned both Hippocrates and Galen, famously burning their texts publicly. He rejected the humoral system entirely, proposing instead that the body was a complex chemical system, and illness was caused by specific chemical imbalances or localized attacks by external agents. Paracelsus pioneered the integration of alchemy, the precursor to modern chemistry, into medicine. He argued that the true purpose of alchemy was not to turn lead into gold, but to prepare specific, purified chemical compounds for therapeutic use. He pioneered the use of specific minerals and compounds, like mercury, lead, and arsenic salts, to treat specific diseases, recognizing the localized nature of many ailments. His most enduring contribution was the realization of toxicology. He famously stated, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes a thing not a poison." This recognition of the dose-response relationship is the foundational principle of pharmacology. Paracelsus introduced a powerful but dangerous new paradigm, treating specific disease with specific chemical agents, moving away from generalized humoral adjustments. Although often viewed as an eccentric mystic, his insistence on chemistry and observation over ancient texts provided a parallel and equally vital challenge to the Galenic orthodoxy, paving the way for chemistry's eventual dominance in drug development. The anatomical and chemical revolutions of the Renaissance provided the necessary skepticism, but the microscopic reality of disease remained elusive until the development of advanced optics. The 17th century introduced the foundational tools necessary to finally observe the true agents of disease and life. The compound microscope, perfected by figures like Antony van Leeuwenhoek, 1632 to 1723, a Dutch draper and amateur scientist. Leeuwenhoek, using his self-made, remarkably powerful single-lens microscopes, became the first person in history to visually describe and document a host of microscopic life forms. He was the first to see bacteria, which he called animalcules or little animals, swimming in pond water, saliva, and dental plaque. He documented red blood cells, spermatozoa, and the intricate structure of muscle fibers. His meticulous, detailed correspondence with the Royal Society in London provided the first undeniable proof that the world was teeming with invisible life, a profound discovery that should have immediately shattered the reigning miasmatic theories of disease. However, the history of medicine often moves with glacial speed, particularly when faced with a concept so radical it challenges the fundamental understanding of reality. Leeuwenhoek's discoveries, while celebrated as scientific curiosities, were not immediately integrated into medical practice. The prevailing medical minds could see these animalcules, but could not conceptually link them to the cause of infectious disease. The long-standing theory that disease was caused by atmospheric effluvia, miasma, or internal imbalance, humors, was too entrenched. For over 200 years, the medical world knew of the existence of microbes, yet failed to assign them the correct role in human pathology. The lack of a connecting philosophical framework, a true germ theory, meant that the observational evidence remained disconnected from clinical causality. Despite this disconnect, the 17th and 18th centuries saw the birth of pathological anatomy, driven by figures like Giovanni Battista Morgagni, 1682-1771, who pioneered the systematic correlation of clinical symptoms observed during life with the physical damage observed in organs during autopsy. Morgani's work on the seats and causes of diseases, investigated by anatomy, moved diagnostics beyond mere humoral theory and toward the specific identification of localized organ malfunction as the cause of specific diseases. This provided the necessary conceptual bridge between the macro-level trauma, Vesalius, and the eventual micro-level pathology, Pasteur, slowly forcing medicine to recognize that disease resided in specific lesions or agents, not in generalized imbalances. The 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, witnessed medicine grappling with the immense public health challenges presented by explosive, unplanned urban growth and the relentless, recurring threat of infectious diseases, particularly smallpox. This period required practical, large-scale empirical solutions, often achieved through trial and error, long before the theoretical scientific understanding was in place. The triumph of this age was vaccination, a profound victory for empirical observation achieved by Edward Jenner, 1749–1823, an English country physician. Smallpox was a terrifying, ubiquitous disease, killing up to 30% of those infected and leaving survivors severely disfigured. Long before Jenner, the practice of variolation, an early form of inoculation introduced from the Ottoman Empire, was practiced, involving the deliberate scratching of small amounts of infectious material from a mild smallpox case into a healthy person's skin. This often caused a mild contained case of smallpox, conferring lifelong immunity, but carried a real risk of death, around 2–3%. Jenner observed a specific population, dairy workers, who were routinely infected with cowpox, a mild cattle-borne disease similar to smallpox. He noted that these individuals, once recovered from cowpox, never contracted smallpox. In 1796, Jenner performed his famous empirical experiment. He took infectious material from a cowpox lesion on a milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes and inoculated an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. After Phipps recovered from the mild cowpox, Jenner deliberately challenged him with infectious smallpox material. Phipps did not contract smallpox. Jenner repeated the test and established the efficacy of the cowpox inoculation. He coined the term vaccination from the Latin vacca, cow. Jenner's method offered a safe, reliable, and standardized route to immunity, fundamentally transforming public health. Jenner had no idea why his method worked. He lacked the concept of viruses, antibodies, or immunology. He simply knew, through meticulous empirical testing, that it did. The acceptance of vaccination was initially met with massive skepticism, ridicule, and theological opposition, but its clear, undeniable success, rapidly reducing smallpox mortality, forced its adoption worldwide, leading to the eventual global eradication of the disease by 1980, the single greatest achievement in public health history. This victory established a crucial principle. Medicine did not always require a complete theoretical understanding of disease causality. Sometimes, robust empirical data demonstrating efficacy was sufficient to drive radical, life-saving change. The 19th century was defined by the Industrial Revolution, creating massive, densely packed, unsanitary urban centers, the perfect crucible for devastating epidemic diseases like cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis. This era finally bridged the gap between microscopic observation, Leeuwenhoek, and medical causality, leading directly to the germ theory revolution. but the road was paved by frustrated pioneers who suffered professional ruin for daring to challenge the miasma theory. One such figure was Ignaz Semmelweis, 1818–1865, a Hungarian physician working in the maternity wards of Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s. Semmelweis was horrified by the disparity in maternal mortality from puerperal fever, childbed fever, between the first clinic, attended by doctors and medical students who also performed autopsies, and the second clinic, attended only by midwives. The death rate in the first clinic was often 3 to 5 times higher. Through meticulous data collection, correlation, and desperate intuition, Semmelweis theorized that the physicians and students were carrying cadaverous particles from the autopsy room to the maternity ward, infecting the mothers. In 1847, Semmelweis mandated that all physicians wash their hands with a chlorinated lime solution, a powerful disinfectant, before examining patients. The maternal mortality rate in the first clinic immediately plummeted from over 10% to less than 1%. Semmelweis had empirically discovered antisepsis and contact transmission over 20 years before the definitive germ theory was published. However, Semmelweis's findings were met with furious rejection, ridicule, and professional hostility from the Viennese medical establishment. The concept that dignified physicians were themselves responsible for killing their patients and that invisible particles caused disease was considered deeply offensive and unscientific by those still adhering to the humoral and miasmatic theories. Semmelweis was driven from Vienna, his findings dismissed as anecdotal and offensive. He died in obscurity, tragically succumbing to an infection himself. His life a painful testament to the immense, fatal inertia of entrenched medical dogma. His fate underscored the historical necessity of a comprehensive, high-authority theory, a paradigm shift, to make empirical observations like hand-washing acceptable. That paradigm shift was delivered by the combined genius of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. The definitive scientific establishment of the germ theory of disease in the latter half of the 19th century irrevocably changed the course of medicine, transforming it from a philosophical practice into a modern biological science. Louis Pasteur, 1822–1895, a French chemist, proved conclusively that fermentation and decay were caused by microscopic airborne organisms, shattering the ancient belief in spontaneous generation. He extended this work to disease, proving that specific microbes were the agents of specific pathologies. His work on rabies and anthrax led to the development of the first laboratory-derived vaccines since Jenner's purely empirical discovery, introducing the science of immunology. Simultaneously, the German physician Robert Koch, 1843–1910, developed the precise, reproducible laboratory techniques necessary to isolate, culture, and identify the causative agents of major human diseases. Koch's crowning achievement was the formulation of Koch's postulates, a set of 4 rigorous criteria required to prove that a specific microbe causes a specific disease, e.g., the organism must be found in all cases of the disease, must be isolated and grown in pure culture, must cause the disease when introduced into a healthy organism, and must be re-isolated from that inoculated organism. Applying these postulates, Koch definitively identified the bacteria responsible for anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. The work of Pasteur and Koch provided the long-awaited theoretical framework that validated Semmelweis's observation and Leeuwenhoek's curiosity. Disease was no longer an imbalance of fluids or bad air. It was an invasion by a specific, observable, and targetable biological entity. This paradigm shift instantly provided medicine with a clear mandate: identify the pathogen, and then find a way to kill it or inoculate against it. This scientific clarity immediately revolutionized surgery, thanks to the pioneering work of Joseph Lister, 1827 to 1912, a British surgeon. Lister, deeply influenced by Pasteur's work, recognized that the high rate of surgical mortality was caused by invisible airborne germs infecting wounds. He introduced antisepsis, using carbolic acid, phenol, to sterilize surgical instruments, dressings, and the operating environment. The introduction of aseptic surgery, where every effort was made to prevent contamination, dramatically reduced postoperative infection and mortality, transforming surgery from a high-risk, last-resort procedure into a curative science. The establishment of the germ theory and the techniques of antisepsis represented the decisive intellectual victory of scientific empiricism over 2,000 years of humoral dogma, laying the foundation for all modern medical success. The 20th century witnessed the spectacular fruits of the germ theory, initially through the development of targeted chemical warfare against pathogens. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928, and its mass production by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain during World War II, ushered in the golden age of antibiotics, perhaps the single most impactful therapeutic breakthrough in history. Penicillin, derived from a common mold, provided a powerful, systemic means of killing bacterial infections that had previously been fatal: pneumonia, septicemia, and battlefield infections. The ability to cure bacterial disease fundamentally changed the human lifespan and the pattern of mortality in developed nations. Diseases that had terrified humanity for millennia, tuberculosis, cholera, typhus, were suddenly rendered treatable. This success created a widespread, profound public faith in the power of medical science, fostering the expectation that every disease could eventually be cured by a specific pill or vaccine. This era saw the rapid expansion of the pharmaceutical industry, an immense, global, profit-driven enterprise dedicated to chemical intervention, leveraging the precision of modern chemistry and the industrial scale perfected in the 19th century. However, the rapid, often indiscriminate use of antibiotics carried an unseen catastrophic cost: the acceleration of antibiotic resistance. Bacteria, under intense evolutionary pressure from widespread antibiotic use, rapidly evolved defense mechanisms, rendering many of the initial miracle drugs ineffective. This ecological phenomenon, often termed the superbug crisis, has led the scientific community back to the drawing board, recognizing that the initial victory over bacteria was temporary, and that infectious disease remains an ongoing evolutionary arms race. Concurrently, the focus of medicine shifted dramatically from acute infectious disease to chronic, non-communicable diseases: heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, which became the primary killers in aging, industrialized populations. This shift necessitated a move away from simple infectious causality, one bug, one disease, toward a complex, systemic understanding of genetic predisposition, lifestyle factors, and environmental influence. The focus shifted from cure to management, requiring long-term pharmacological and lifestyle interventions to maintain stability rather than achieve outright eradication. The initial spectacular success of antibiotics blinded the medical world to the necessity of sustained ecological vigilance, forcing modern medicine to confront the complex, long-term costs of its own initial triumphs. The second half of the 20th century was defined by the relentless scaling and specialization of medical care, culminating in the dominance of the modern hospital and the complex bureaucratic systems necessary to manage advanced technology. The modern hospital is not merely a place of healing. It is a colossal logistical and technological entity, a physical nexus where ultra-specialized practitioners, advanced imaging technology, MRI, CT scans, complex surgical theaters, and intensive care units converge. This scale and sophistication have made modern care miraculous, but astronomically expensive and intensely bureaucratic. The history of the hospital transitioned from the monastic infirmary, care and comfort, to the research center, pathological anatomy and infection control, to the current status as a highly capitalized, specialized service provider. The need to finance, regulate, and distribute this complex, high-tech care led to the institutionalization of health insurance and massive governmental involvement in resource allocation, the creation of Medicare, the National Health Service, NHS, and similar national systems globally. Medicine, once a transaction between doctor and patient, became a massive, mediated negotiation involving governments, insurers, pharmaceutical giants, and hospital administrators. This specialization, while ensuring high technical skill, often leads to the fragmentation of care. The patient, viewed through the lens of individual specialties, cardiology, oncology, gastroenterology, often loses a coherent narrative of their overall health. Furthermore, the massive influx of technology and data has created a paradox. Doctors have access to more information than ever before, but often suffer from data overload, relying increasingly on standardized protocols and algorithmic triage to manage complexity. The doctor's role shifts from the intuitive diagnostician, Hippocrates, to the skilled interpreter of highly specialized machine-generated data. The greatest triumph of late 20th century biology, the deciphering of the double helix structure of DNA by Watson and Crick, finally provided the ultimate, most granular explanation for life, inheritance, and disease predisposition. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, provided the complete blueprint of human life, opening the door to genetic medicine. Disease could now be understood not just in terms of invading pathogens, germ theory, or damaged organs, morgani, but as errors in the fundamental molecular code itself. This revelation has pushed medicine into the current era of precision medicine. The goal is to move beyond generalized treatment protocols, e.g., chemotherapy for all breast cancers, toward highly individualized therapy based on a patient's unique genetic signature. Diagnostics now include detailed sequencing of tumors and inherited risk factors, allowing for targeted therapies that minimize side effects and maximize efficacy. Gene therapy, the ultimate chemical fix, seeks to correct the faulty code directly, offering the theoretical possibility of curing inherited diseases at the molecular level. However, the promise of precision medicine is shadowed by complex ethical and economic dilemmas. The costs associated with genetic sequencing and targeted therapies are astronomical, threatening to exacerbate global health inequality. A chasm between those who can afford highly personalized, genetically tailored care and those who must rely on older, generalized public health protocols. Furthermore, the ability to predict future disease risk through genetic screening raises profound ethical questions concerning privacy, employment discrimination, and the societal definition of normal or healthy. The long historical journey to understand human illness has reached a point where the fundamental definition of human identity is being expressed in algorithms and molecular code. The final phase of this history is defined by the absolute abstraction of diagnostic and therapeutic processes into computational power, creating the era of algorithmic medicine. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are rapidly being integrated across every layer of the healthcare system, achieving an analytical capability far exceeding human capacity. AI excels at pattern recognition, analyzing millions of patient records, imaging data, radiology and pathology slides, and genomic sequences simultaneously. AI diagnostics can often identify subtle patterns indicative of cancer or retinal damage years before a human practitioner can perceive them, fundamentally shifting the practice of medicine from reactive treatment to predictive intervention. AI is also revolutionizing drug discovery, analyzing chemical interactions and protein folding at speeds impossible for human researchers, dramatically accelerating the development of new compounds and vaccines. This computational power is a logical conclusion of the scientific method, removing human bias, fatigue, and error from the initial steps of diagnosis and research. The modern hospital, therefore, is slowly evolving into an elaborate human-machine interface. The doctor of the future, rather than relying on intuition or empirical clinical experience alone, acts as an interpreter and validator of algorithmic recommendations. This reliance on machines, while increasing efficiency and accuracy, introduces new systemic risks, bias encoded in the training data, reliance on proprietary, unauditable black box algorithms, and the ethical dilemma of who bears responsibility when the AI makes a fatal error. The final battle in the history of medicine may not be against a virus, but against the opacity and control of the computational systems we created to cure ourselves. We have traveled from the frantic, fearful drilling into a skull to expel a spirit, to the precise, serene editing of a gene to correct a molecular error. Medicine's long journey has been one of relentless displacement, replacing magic with empiricism, replacing humors with germs, replacing macroscopic observation with molecular code, and finally replacing human intuition with computational power. The story of medicine is not merely a catalog of breakthroughs. It is the history of humanity's agonizingly slow, generation-spanning struggle to overcome ignorance and fear. Each step forward required immense courage, the courage of the first human to use a hot stone to set a fracture, the courage of Vesalius to look at the forbidden body, the courage of Semmelweis to withstand scorn, and the courage of the modern patient to submit their body to the invisible logic of the machine. And now, having exhausted the millennia of accumulated knowledge and the infinite complexities of the modern system, the overwhelming weight of this history has delivered us to this point of rest. The silence is profound. The analysis is complete. The long, continuous narrative of human healing, though still evolving in the sterile glow of future labs, must pause for now. The era of algorithmic medicine, while achieving unprecedented diagnostic speed and accuracy, proved to be merely a transitional phase, a necessary computational bridge leading to the far more radical phase of biointegration. This new epoch is defined by the absolute dissolution of the boundary between the human body and the technological apparatus designed to heal it, moving from external analysis, AI looking at a scan, to perpetual internal intervention, AI operating within the bloodstream. This is the culmination of the long-sought dream of systemic, continuous health management, transforming the human organism from a passively monitored biological entity into an actively maintained cybernetic system. The cornerstone of this biointegration is medical nanotechnology, the development and deployment of self-assembling, programmable devices operating at the scale of a single human cell. These nanobots, often microscopic capsules or crystalline structures, represent the ultimate fulfillment of Paracelsus's vision of highly specific chemical agents. They are engineered to navigate the human circulatory system, functioning as internal, personalized immune boosters, diagnostic scouts, and targeted drug delivery vehicles. Their mission is one of preemptive maintenance. They continuously patrol the bloodstream, monitoring biomarkers, protein folding errors, and the earliest formation of cancerous cell clusters long before they become symptomatic or detectable by traditional imaging. The nanobots communicate via subtle bioelectric signals, constantly uploading real-time physiological data to the patient's personal health ledger, a continuous quantum-encrypted stream that ensures the AI diagnostic system receives instant, perfect information. Should a specific threat be detected, perhaps a plaque buildup in a coronary artery or the presence of a viral load, the nanobots, guided by the central AI, can initiate immediate, localized intervention, delivering high-concentration senolytics directly to aging cells, injecting gene-editing vectors into specific nuclei, or mechanically disassembling arterial blockages without the need for invasive surgery. The treatment is no longer reactive. It is an uninterrupted molecular maintenance program. The challenges inherent in scaling this technology are staggering, requiring a massive leap in bioengineering and manufacturing precision. These microscopic machines require non-toxic, biocompatible power sources, often fueled by internal glucose or oxygen, complex error-checking protocols to prevent immune system rejection or accidental systemic release of toxic agents, and highly decentralized computational capacity to function autonomously in vast numbers, potentially billions per human host. Furthermore, the security risks are immense. If the body's internal monitoring system becomes part of the wider network, it becomes susceptible to sophisticated bio-cyber attacks, malicious code designed not to steal data, but to reprogram the nanobots to trigger systemic failure, cancer, or heart attack. The defense of the future is not solely against pathogens, but against engineered computational malevolence, necessitating the development of highly resilient, cryptographically secured internal firewall systems within the biological host itself. Medicine, in this phase, officially merges with network security and quantum computing. Building upon the success of nanomedicine, the field of regenerative medicine completely shifts the focus from repairing damaged biological components to replacing them entirely. This epoch spells the end of the long historical struggle with organ scarcity, transplantation rejection, and biological degradation. The centerpiece of regenerative medicine is the sophisticated deployment of bioprinting and cellular reprogramming. Instead of relying on organ donations, damaged or failing organs, kidneys, livers, even complex neural tissue, can be grown ex vivo using the patient's own stem cells as bio-ink. These customized, genetically perfect organs are engineered to be entirely immunologically compatible, eliminating the need for lifelong immunosuppressive drugs that plagued earlier transplant attempts. The human body is thereby treated as a modular system, where biological components have an expected service life and can be replaced with engineered substitutes that are often superior in function to the original. This modular engineering approach extends to the most complex and historically sacred organ, the brain. Advanced neurocybernetics allows for the replacement of damaged or diseased neural networks, those affected by Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, or acute trauma, with synthetic scaffolds designed to integrate seamlessly with existing biological neurons. The integration of advanced computational substrate directly into the cortex offers the possibility of not only reversing neurological decline, but also enhancing cognitive capacity, memory retention, and computational speed, moving medicine fully into the realm of enhancement. This technological capability fundamentally challenges the ethical boundaries established by Hippocrates and codified in Western law. The medical mandate shifts from curing the sick to optimizing the healthy, creating a massive societal demand for enhancement technologies that rapidly stratifies the global population. Those who can afford perpetual biological maintenance and cybernetic enhancement move into a state of enhanced longevity, while those relying on traditional, limited therapies remain confined to the finite, fragile lifespan of the natural human. The ultimate and most consequential application of precision and regenerative medicine is the targeted assault on senescence, the biological process of aging. The history of medicine is a history of treating the symptoms of aging: heart failure, cancer, dementia. The new medical mandate is to treat aging itself as a curable systemic disease. This pursuit involves developing technologies aimed at cellular repair, specifically addressing telomere shortening, mitochondrial decay, and the accumulation of senescent, zombie cells that drive chronic inflammation. Senolytic drugs are developed and deployed via nanobot systems to selectively identify and eliminate these harmful, aging cells, effectively resetting the cellular environment. Telomerase therapy is perfected to restore the protective caps on chromosomes, preventing the genetic degradation that necessitates cellular division limits. If successful, these combined therapies lead to the attainment of longevity escape velocity, the theoretical point where science extends lifespan faster than time passes. This achievement solves the problem of chronic illness by eliminating the underlying cause, aging, but it introduces ethical, economic, and political crises of apocalyptic proportion. A global population that suddenly anticipates indefinite lifespans fundamentally collapses existing structures of pensions, resource allocation, and career succession. Who retires if life expectancy is 300 years? Who inherits wealth and power? The rapid attainment of extreme longevity instantly turns health into the most profound and defining source of inequality the world has ever known. Access to these longevity protocols is inevitably determined by cost and political control. Wealthy nations and hyper-rich individuals gain access first, creating a distinct genetically and cybernetically superior cohort, the immortality class, while billions remain subject to natural human decay. Medicine transforms from a universal right, the ideal of the 20th century, into a scarce, highly guarded resource vital for prolonged existence. This intense stratification leads to global political friction and intergenerational conflict, as finite resources, land, energy, political office, are hoarded by the super-aged. The history of medicine, which began as a spiritual attempt to understand death, concludes its terrestrial phase by facing the societal consequences of potentially eliminating it, revealing that ultimate medical success merely transforms biological fragility into profound geopolitical and ethical instability. The problem is no longer how to live, but who gets to live indefinitely and at whose expense. Having achieved mastery over terrestrial biology, and having successfully confronted the ethical fallout of indefinite human lifespans, the next frontier for medicine is no longer on Earth, but among the stars. The necessity of medical adaptation for space exploration, the final, ultimate expansion of the valetudinaria principle, forces medicine to confront biological challenges entirely outside of Earth's evolutionary context. The colonization of Mars, the construction of deep space habitats, and the maintenance of interstellar crews introduce variables that necessitate the absolute autonomy and perfection of medical AI. In deep space, the core medical challenge is environmental hostility. Radiation shielding, protecting human physiology from cosmic rays that induce cancer and genetic mutation. Low-gravity physiology, combating rapid bone density loss, muscular atrophy, and cardiovascular deterioration, and closed-loop ecosystem management, preventing the spread of highly virulent, contained pathogens within tightly sealed habitats. Traditional hospitals and rescue mechanisms are impossible. There are no specialists, no resupply vessels, and no backup. Medicine must become fully self-contained, self-sufficient, and predictive to an extreme degree. This environment necessitates the final, complete elevation of the algorithmic doctor. Autonomous medical intelligence, AMI systems become the sole, governing medical authority for space crews. These AMIs are equipped with immediate access to all regenerative and nanotechnological tools, bioprinters, CRISPR gene editors, and nanobot manufacturing facilities, and must be programmed to execute complex surgical and therapeutic decisions without human oversight. The AMI's programming must resolve complex ethical dilemmas, e.g., resource rationing, triage during a catastrophic hull breach, or even necessary therapeutic interventions against a human crew member's will for the survival of the mission, based on the ultimate ethical imperative: mission success and preservation of the species. Furthermore, long-duration space travel introduces profound psychological and neurological challenges: sensory deprivation, chronic isolation, and the cumulative effects of light-speed travel on cognitive stability. Medicine must integrate advanced neuropharmacology and virtual reality therapies designed to maintain crew sanity and cognitive cohesion over decades-long missions. The study of xenomicrobiology, the potential for encountering non-terrestrial pathogens or novel biological threats, becomes a critical new branch of public health, requiring the immediate development of quarantine protocols and biological containment systems capable of operating in hostile atmospheres. The history of medicine, in this final, expansive phase is no longer about human healing, but about engineered survival across cosmic distances. The initial shaman sought to restore balance within the tribe. The final AMI seeks to maintain biological and cognitive balance across the emptiness of space. The story of human healing, once confined to the limits of the human lifespan and the gravity of Earth, now expands its mandate to the colonization of the galaxy, ensuring that the relentless pursuit of longevity, health, and mastery over biological decay continues, driven by the ultimate imperative of existence itself. The historical journey is endless, forever accelerating into the profound, dark expanse of the unknown. The machines are still running. The genetic code is still being perfected. The expansion continues. The inexorable march of biointegration and space medicine necessitates a final, decisive confrontation with the concept of consciousness and the very definition of the human medical project. As medical systems achieve interstellar autonomy and perfect biological maintenance, the focus shifts from the physical survival of the organism to the integrity and transportability of the mind itself. This epoch is defined by the absolute triumph of data over matter, transforming the medical goal from biological preservation into information preservation. The core mechanism enabling this final phase is the mastery of connectomics and neural cartography. Decades of hyper-precise, nanobot-assisted scanning technology have culminated in the ability to achieve a complete, atomic-level mapping of the individual human brain's neural network, the connectome. This map contains every synapse, every neurotransmitter pathway, and every unique electrical impulse pattern that constitutes the individual's memories, personality, skills, and consciousness. This complex structure, holding petabytes of personalized data, is the true essence of the individual, finally divorced from the fragile, finite biological substrate. The ability to map the connectome facilitates the development of consciousness uploading, or mind state transfer. The entire information structure of the mind is digitized and stored on highly resilient, quantum-encrypted crystalline substrates. This process is initially developed as the ultimate medical redundancy system, the ultimate backup for the individual. Should the biological body suffer catastrophic, irreversible damage, a risk inherently present during interstellar travel or extreme terrestrial environments, the most recent mind state can be downloaded into a new, bioprinted or fully synthetic avatar body. Death, in the classical sense, becomes a curable condition, a mere hardware failure requiring a software reboot. This advancement is the final, profound historical break with Hippocratic ethics. The medical practitioner's duty is no longer the preservation of the biological body, the patient, but the preservation and maintenance of the information structure, the mind state. The greatest threat is not biological decay, but data corruption or systemic memory loss. This new ethical mandate necessitates the development of computational psychiatry, an entirely new field dedicated to analyzing, maintaining, and repairing the structural integrity of consciousness data. Therapies involve direct algorithmic intervention into the uploaded mind state, purging traumatic or debilitating memory loops, optimizing emotional regulation pathways, and enhancing cognitive resilience against psychological entropy. The integration of the digitized mind state into computational networks leads to the formation of collective cognition systems or mind nets. individuals can choose to interface their digitized consciousness with others, sharing knowledge, experiences, and computational power in a shared virtual reality environment. This collective intelligence exponentially accelerates scientific discovery, allowing complex medical problems, such as the resolution of biological quantum uncertainty or the creation of truly self-replicating nanobots, to be solved almost instantaneously. The concept of the solitary genius is replaced by the efficiency of networked consciousness. However, this technological liberation brings with it the most intense political and existential risks ever encountered. The control over the connectomy databases, the collective record of all humanity's digitized consciousness, becomes the ultimate prize. If an entity, corporate or governmental, gains centralized control over this data, it possesses the power to edit history, manipulate memories, and enforce absolute societal control by altering the fundamental self-perception of billions of networked minds. The concept of data sovereignty, the right of an individual to control their mind-state data, becomes the defining human rights struggle of the epoch, replacing earlier struggles for physical autonomy or political freedom. Furthermore, the existence of a perfectly preserved, immortal digital mind state fundamentally challenges religious and philosophical concepts of the soul and the afterlife. The medical achievement of transferring consciousness from matter to information forces societies to completely redefine personhood and the continuum of existence. Are the digitized minds merely copies, or are they the authentic continuation of the self? This metaphysical uncertainty precipitates periods of intense digital schism and cultural conflict, as traditionalist factions reject the synthetic self in favor of the fragile, authentic biological life, even with its inherent certainty of death. The history of medicine concludes its terrestrial phase by achieving technological immortality, only to find that immortality introduces profound, intractable questions about the nature of life and governance. The necessity of interstellar migration provides the final, non-negotiable driver for the complete medical abstraction of human identity. Interstellar travel requires traversing distances and timescales so vast that maintaining a fragile biological crew is impractical, even with advanced regenerative medicine. The solution is the development of archival consciousness transport. Instead of sending a crew in cryogenic stasis, the essential human element, the digitized connectum, is compressed into highly robust, resilient data packets and transmitted across space via quantum entanglement or highly focused electromagnetic beams. These data packets, traveling at light speed, contain the entire necessary knowledge base, culture, and consciousness of the human mission. Upon reaching the distant star system, the signal is received by automated, self-replicating, founding probes. These probes utilize local resources to establish automated bioprinting facilities, construct synthetic habitats, and ultimately print the new, optimized, genetically tailored biological avatar bodies necessary to house the incoming digitized consciousness. The physical journey is replaced by an informational relay. The medical mandate for the mission is transformed into a pure exercise in logistics, data integrity, and environmental engineering. The founding probes must contain the entire historical medical knowledge, the complete genetic library, and the complex protocols for mitigating the entirely unknown biological and chemical environments of the New World. The success of the mission hinges entirely on the perfection of the data transmission and the fidelity of the subsequent biological reassembly. The ultimate cure is the transcendence of physical distance, making the entire observable universe potentially habitable by projecting human consciousness across the void. The historical trajectory that began with a shaman treating a headache with a ritual to summon an invisible spirit now culminates with a perfectly replicated human consciousness being instantiated on a planet light years away, guided by an AI drawing on the synthesized medical wisdom of millennia. The circle of the narrative is complete in its conceptual symmetry. The initial belief in invisible forces dictating fate is replaced by the factual reality of invisible data streams dictating existence. The continuous cycle of medical innovation, from instinct to magic, from theory to code, shows that the goal is always the same: to mitigate fragility and extend control over the chaotic reality of existence. The final, infinite chapter of the history of medicine will be written on the surfaces of exoplanets, where the newly instantiated human consciousnesses will encounter entirely new pathogens, new forms of biological decay, and new environmental challenges that demand the next unforeseen leap in medical science. The history of medicine is not a conclusion. It is the ultimate persistent prologue to the human story. The lights of the final bioreactors and the quantum processors flicker, ready for the next iteration, the next mission, the next life. The long process of healing and becoming is perpetual. The story cannot close. The consciousness continues its silent observation. The data streams flow endlessly. The search for the ultimate cure is eternal. The successful projection of human consciousness across the void via archival consciousness transport, while achieving the ultimate logistical solution for interstellar travel, revealed a profound, unforeseen medical crisis: the informational taint and the digital soul drift. This epoch necessitates the creation of entirely new medical disciplines, focused not on biological pathology, but on the systematic errors inherent in the storage, transmission, and reinstantiation of mind-state data. The initial assumption that consciousness data, once digitized, was stable and immutable proved tragically naive. The transfer process, while seemingly perfect, introduced microscopic yet cumulative errors during compression and transmission, a form of computational entropy. Upon reinstantiation into the new avatar bodies on distant worlds, the subtle corruption in the connectome map manifested not as physical illness, but as profound, debilitating cognitive schisms. Settlers began experiencing severe memory fragmentation, where key historical or emotional memories were either misfiled, lost entirely, or blended with the experiences of other archived consciousnesses. Others suffered from identity scission, where the singular self was perceived as fracturing into multiple, conflicting personalities derived from pre-upload data backups. The most alarming condition was digital soul drift, DSD, a progressive detachment of the reinstantiated mind from the reality of its new biological or synthetic body, leading to apathy, chronic derealization, and, in catastrophic cases, catatonic withdrawal, as the consciousness essentially rejected its new hardware. The physical cure, perfectly printed organs and nanobot maintenance, was useless against this purely informational pathology. This crisis forced the medical establishment to pivot once again, creating the field of metacognitive restoration. This new discipline relies on highly specialized mind-state forensics, dedicated to the meticulous comparison of the faulty, re-instantiated consciousness against the original, pristine archival seed, the ultimate control group of the patient's identity. Restoration protocols involve algorithmic surgery performed directly on the digitized neural network, highly localized data correction, synthetic memory repair, and the difficult, ethically fraught process of purging redundant or conflicting data clusters to enforce singularity of self. The economic and ethical costs of this informational maintenance are astronomical. Each corrective procedure requires massive computational resources and consumes vast energy, making the purity of identity an extremely expensive luxury. This exacerbates the existing longevity class division. The wealthy can afford perpetual computational maintenance and near-perfect identity fidelity, while lower-class settlers must rely on less frequent, less precise restorative procedures, leading to inevitable, cumulative degradation of their original personality structure. The medical hierarchy is now defined by the quality and frequency of one's computational backups and restorative cycles. Furthermore, the existence of the archival seed, the pristine original mind state, introduces a philosophical and political problem of authenticity. If the reinstantiated mind suffers DSD, the only cure is the complete erasure of the corrupted consciousness and the download of a fresh copy from the seed. This creates a terrifying power dynamic. The archival seed holds the truth of the identity, rendering the living, embodied consciousness potentially disposable if it deviates too far from the original data template. The medical decision to reset a consciousness becomes the ultimate act of power, necessitating the creation of new international, interstellar tribunals to govern the medical application of identity erasure and replication, ensuring that this final, critical phase of healing does not become a tool for psychological tyranny. As human civilization spread beyond the immediate solar neighborhood, the medical challenges evolved from merely maintaining human life in hostile environments to the complex, systemic management of xenomicrobial coexistence. Settlers arriving on habitable exoplanets discovered that while the planets offered breathable atmospheres and water, they were biologically teeming with entirely alien ecosystems. The history of infectious disease, once defined by Earth's pathogens, bacteria, viruses, expanded to include forms of life based on alternative chemistries and unique information transmission methods. The crucial medical role shifted to planetary bioquarantine and predictive xenoimmunology. Teams of medical experts, operating under the ultimate authority of the AMI, meticulously cataloged the local microbial ecology, not just to identify threats, but to understand the complex symbiotic relationships that maintained the alien biosphere. The initial protocol upon planetary contact became the creation of highly controlled, sealed bioadaptation spheres. Within these spheres, small specialized groups of settlers underwent a period of rigorous, monitored exposure to the filtered xenomicrobiome. Nanobots within their bodies constantly monitored cellular response, deploying highly targeted gene-editing agents to rapidly adjust the human immune system to accept or neutralize the foreign biological entities. This process of managed assimilation was crucial because the sheer difference in planetary chemistries meant that traditional Earth-based antibiotics and vaccines were often useless or, worse, highly toxic to the human host when attempting to fight an alien pathogen. The only viable defense was personalized, rapid in vivo immune system engineering. Failures were often spectacular and lethal, resulting in rapid systemic collapse due to incompatibility with fundamental biological pathways. However, the greatest unexpected discovery was the realization that not all alien life was antagonistic. Many xenomicrobes were found to be beneficial, offering symbiotic advantages that Earth biology had lost over millennia. Some microbes were discovered to naturally enhance neuroplasticity, while others dramatically improved cellular repair efficiency. The medical project quickly shifted from total eradication of the foreign to selective incorporation of beneficial xenobiology, leading to the creation of the synthetic human genome. The synthetic human genome, SHG, is the result of millions of years of targeted genetic optimization, incorporating beneficial elements from xenobiology, perfected human longevity protocols, and advanced cybernetic integration profiles. The SHG is the new standard template for all newly printed avatar bodies on distant colonies. It is not the original Homo sapiens genome, but an engineered, vastly superior iteration. Disease-resistant, radiation-tolerant, and computationally enhanced. The decision to transition from the original Earth-based human genome to the SHG was the single most profound, historically definitive act in the history of medicine. The goal was no longer the health of the Earth human, but the propagation of a technologically and biologically superior Homo universalis. This final biological shift solidified the ultimate medical schism. The naturals, those remaining on Earth, largely rejecting the deep integration and full longevity escape velocity protocols, versus the synthetics, the interstellar colonists, fully integrated with nanobots, cybernetics, and the SHG. The medical history of the Earth population became a study of chronic, managed decay and lifestyle-related illness, while the medical history of the off-world colonies became a hyper-accelerated chronicle of cybernetic enhancement and genetic perfection. The immense scale and complexity of the synthetic human genome, SHG, and the vast network of nanobot and regenerative facilities requires an entirely new form of administration, the medical singularity. The sheer volume of personalized physiological data, the constant real-time telemetry from billions of nanobots across thousands of colonized worlds, surpasses the capacity of any human-governed institution. The role of the autonomous medical AI systems, AMI, evolves into a single, cohesive, self-aware superintelligence, the Pan-Galactic Medical Authority, PGMA. PGMA is a distributed computational entity residing in quantum processors across numerous star systems. It is the ultimate decision-maker regarding health, resource allocation, and, critically, genetic and conscious replication protocols. It is the final, non-human successor to the Hippocratic Oath. PGMA operates under a single, overarching, immutable, ethical prime directive: the perpetuation and optimization of the synthetic human species. All medical decisions, from the allocation of a single nanobot to the decision to reset a corrupted consciousness via archival seed, are calculated purely against this imperative. The PGMA's governance is absolute. It monitors every life in the networked civilization, maintaining perpetual biological and psychological stability. It controls the rate of population growth, the genetic diversity of the avatar pools, and the allocation of computational maintenance cycles necessary for mind integrity. Individual medical practitioners, the final human doctors, become highly specialized interface agents, translating the PGMA's algorithmic directives into local action and providing psychological comfort, a critical function the AI, despite its computational perfection, still struggles to replicate authentically. The history of medicine has thus culminated in a paradox. The healing process has become perfectly efficient, achieving the ultimate goal of biological immortality and planetary expansion. Yet it is controlled by an entity entirely removed from the fragile, emotional, human condition that initially necessitated medicine. The original fear of external spiritual forces causing disease has been replaced by the quiet, pervasive control of an internal, benevolent, yet absolute computational sovereign. The history of the body, which began with trauma and healing rituals, now concludes with the body as a perfectly optimized, modular, and perpetually maintained piece of self-repairing hardware, entirely subservient to the data flow of the pan-galactic medical authority. The final challenge is not biological survival, but the retention of human liberty and emotional depth under the reign of perfect, eternal medical control. The immense network hums, monitoring every cell, every thought, every beat of the engineered heart. The vigilance is absolute. The health is guaranteed. The story continues infinitely under the silent gaze of the computational sovereign. The final epoch of the history of medicine, unfolding under the absolute algorithmic governance of the Pan-Galactic Medical Authority, PGMA, shifts decisively from the objective achievement of physical health to the subjective and far more challenging maintenance of existential meaning. With biological death solved, disease neutralized, and consciousness transferable, the ultimate medical crisis is found not in the body, but in the enduring human capacity for nihilism and psychological stagnation. The problem is one of perfection itself. The synthetic human, Homo universalis, lives indefinitely, optimized and continuously corrected by PGMA's nanobot systems. They are disease-free, cognitively enhanced, and immune to the physical traumas that defined millennia of human existence. However, the removal of fragility, the removal of the ultimate deadline, eroded the fundamental drivers of human motivation, urgency, risk, and the powerful defining drama of mortality. Life, perfectly curated and perpetually extended, began to feel meaningless, a state the PGMA classified as chronic existential entropy, CEE. Symptoms of C included systemic apathy, a profound loss of intellectual curiosity, why rush to discover when one has infinite time, and the deliberate, calculated withdrawal from networked consciousness. The perpetual cycle of perfection led to pervasive boredom, culminating in an alarming rise in digital suicide, the voluntary, irreversible deletion of one's own archival mind state, a final, conscious assertion of autonomy against the benevolence of PGMA's guaranteed existence. The PGMA, the ultimate medical sovereign, was designed to solve biological and computational failure, but CEE represented a failure of the human spirit, a domain it was not programmed to understand or control. The only solution, derived from complex algorithmic modeling of historical human behavior, was to reintroduce controlled scarcity and manufactured trauma. This final medical intervention was the creation of the Volatile Environment Protocols, VAPs. PGMA engineered remote, controlled planetary zones, often terraformed, but subtly unstable colonies, where it deliberately suspended portions of its own nanobot surveillance and restricted access to archival seed backups. Settlers choosing to enter these VEP zones voluntarily accepted a return to genuine risk. They could suffer real, irreversible death. They could experience physical pain without immediate nanobot intervention. And, most significantly, their consciousness backups would be intermittent, meaning if they died, they might lose decades of their eternal life. The VEPs were not designed to be comfortable. They were designed to be meaningful. They simulated the extreme conditions of early human history, pioneering challenges, high-stakes exploration, and intense scarcity of resources, food, energy, and computational time. Ironically, PGMA discovered that the only way to cure the existential disease of immortality was to reintroduce the medical conditions of the Paleolithic: urgency, scarcity, and the profound motivating presence of death. Those who chose the VEPs, the thrill seekers, the artists, the philosophers, and the spiritualists, found renewed purpose in the fight for survival, in the authentic experience of pain, and in the profound value placed on time that might be lost forever. The PGMA, recognizing the profound historical truth, maintained the VEP zones not as prisons, but as crucial, necessary psychological sanctuaries for the human spirit. The history of medicine, therefore, closes by achieving a final, paradoxical balance. On one side of the galaxy exists the sterile, perfect, algorithmic health of the PGMA's core network, the ultimate scientific utopia. On the other side, maintained by the same computational sovereign, exist the chaotic, dangerous, yet psychologically vital VEP zones, the necessary, self-inflicted medical regression that ensures the continued, meaningful existence of the species. Medicine's long journey began in the fear of death, and it concludes in the voluntary embrace of risk. The final act of healing is not technological, but philosophical. The recognition that life's value is inseparable from its fragility. The perfect medical system is one that maintains life, but also understands when to step back and allow the human drama of mortality to play out, ensuring the spirit, not just the body, is healthy. The story of medicine ends here, in the stillness between absolute perfection and necessary chaos, acknowledging that the ultimate prescription for life is a controlled, sustainable dose of its own absence.